Most of what's sitting in your bread drawer right now has never been independently tested by the company that sells it to you. We looked into 9 of the biggest bread brands in America, the loaves that show up in most kitchens in this country, and started with the one data set that actually exists. Florida's Department of Health pulled 8 bread products from 5 national brands off grocery shelves in early 2026 under a program called Healthy Florida First and sent every sample to a certified lab. 6 of those 8 products came back positive for glyphosate, the active chemical in Roundup. The readings ranged from 10.38 parts per billion up to 191.04 parts per billion. Here's the honest part. Nobody in this space usually says out loud. Every single one of those numbers, even the highest one, falls inside the EPA's legal tolerance for wheat. Legal isn't the same question as zero, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that distinction matters and which brands never got tested at all. It's also worth knowing what this data set is not. Earlier glyphosate testing rounds, a 2018 Environmental Working Group study on children's cereal, a 2016 report from Food Democracy Now!, and the Detox Project covering 29 popular foods never tested a single loaf of bread. They tested oats and crackers and cereal. Florida's 2026 round is the first time anyone has published a bread-specific number at all, which is exactly why the brands with no test result attached to them matter as much as the ones with a high one. We're counting down all 9 from concerning to genuinely uncomfortable and finishing with the 4 that earned a real certification instead of just a marketing claim. Every number in this video is from a published source, and the full list is in the description below. Let's get into it. Number 9, Great Value Whole Wheat. This is Walmart's house bread, cheap, familiar, never out of stock. Here's the honest answer on this one. We looked for a published glyphosate test result for Great Value Whole Wheat, and we couldn't find one. Not from Florida's Department of Health, which never included this brand in its testing round. Not from any other public lab result we could locate anywhere. That silence is the entire story here. Walmart's house bread is one of the best-selling loaves in the country, and as far as the public record shows, nobody outside the company has ever checked it for this specific chemical. Flip the bag over anyway because there's still something to learn there. Press down on the loaf before you do. Real bread gives a little under your palm and holds some of that shape. A loaf engineered around shelf-stable dough conditioners tends to compress flat and spring back almost instantly, closer to packaging foam than baked flour. That's not a lab result. It's just something you can feel for yourself in the aisle before anything goes in the cart. Mass-produced sandwich bread like this typically carries a short list of dough conditioners and preservatives on the ingredient panel. Names like calcium propionate, DATEM, and sodium stearoyl lactylate show up across the category constantly. Calcium propionate is a mold inhibitor, and a small double-blind study from 2002 published in the Journal of Pediatrics and Child Health and following 27 children found it was associated with irritability, restlessness, inattention, and sleep disturbance in some of them, linked to, not proven to cause. The study's own authors were careful about that distinction, and so are we. What matters here isn't a scary number, because there isn't one to report. What matters is that the EPA's legal ceiling for glyphosate on wheat sits at 30 parts per million, 30,000 parts per billion, and a bread this size, sold at this scale, has simply never been checked against it in public. We're not claiming Great Value would test high. We can't make that claim because the data doesn't exist for anyone to check. Number 8. Simple Truth Organic Whole Wheat, Kroger's premium store brand. This loaf carries a USDA organic seal and whole wheat flour listed first on the panel, and it sits at nearly double the price of Great Value one aisle over, specifically because the seal is supposed to mean something cleaner. Same story as the last brand. Florida never tested Simple Truth, and no public lab result for this specific loaf turned up anywhere in our research. Here's the nuance worth understanding before you assume the organic label settles the question either way. USDA organic certification verifies that the farmer growing this particular crop didn't spray glyphosate on purpose. It says nothing about drift, herbicide mist from a conventional field next door settling on an organic crop it was never sprayed on. This isn't a hypothetical. Drift contamination on organic crops growing near conventionally sprayed fields is a documented phenomenon in agricultural science, not a fringe theory, and it's precisely the mechanism that would explain an organic loaf testing no better or even worse than a conventional one sitting on the same shelf. Nothing about USDA organic certification requires the finished loaf itself to be lab tested for glyphosate residue after the fact. Two different claims wearing the same green leaf. The seal is technically accurate. It's also strategically incomplete because nothing on the front of this bag tells you the difference exists. We're not saying Simple Truth has a drift problem. We're saying the organic seal alone doesn't rule one out, and Kroger doesn't publish testing data on this product that would settle it either way. Number 7. Arnold whole grains. Arnold has been a familiar name in the bread aisle for generations, and the whole grains line was positioned as the health-conscious update. Whole grain listed first, a simple wrapper, nothing that screams processed. Arnold is owned by Grupo Bimbo, the same parent company behind Sara Lee, Oro Wheat, and Thomas's, and Grupo Bimbo reported roughly $20 billion in net sales in 2024. Here's where this one gets specific instead of vague. Arnold was named alongside Sara Lee, Oro Wheat, and Thomas's in a California federal class action, Ang versus Bimbo Bakeries USA, filed in 2013, alleging the company's whole grain and 100% whole wheat labeling overstated how much whole grain was actually in the loaf relative to what the front of the bag implied. That case was certified and eventually settled with label changes. No public glyphosate figure for Arnold whole grains specifically exists in the sources we reviewed. We looked, and we couldn't locate one. But a company with a documented history of overstating what's inside the bag on this exact product line is worth remembering before you take the whole grain claim at face value again. Pinch a slice between two fingers and roll it gently. It should feel like bread, springy and slightly uneven, the way flour, water, and yeast behave when nothing has been added to smooth them out. A loaf that feels uniform all the way through, with no give and no texture variation, is telling you something about its ingredient list before you've even turned the bag over. Number 6, Wonder Bread. Wonder doesn't claim to be organic or artisanal. It sells nostalgia, the loaf that's been on American counters for generations. Florida's Department of Health tested Wonder Bread Classic White in that February 2026 round and recorded 173.19 parts per billion of glyphosate. Wonder Bread is owned by Flowers Foods, the same company that owns Nature's Own and Flowers. Foods reported $5.1 billion in fiscal 2024 sales. That 173.19 figure sits comfortably inside the EPA's 30,000 parts per billion ceiling for wheat, nowhere close to it. Legal is not in question here. What's worth sitting with is that this bread doesn't arrive at your table as one isolated exposure. It's part of a pattern repeated across breakfast, lunch, and dinner, loaf after loaf, year after year, and the tolerance the EPA calculated was set for one chemical in one food eaten by one healthy adult in isolation. It was never built to model a body eating bread daily for decades on top of everything else glyphosate shows up in. Flip this loaf over and read the ingredient panel slowly instead of skimming it. Enriched bleached flour sits near the top of most conventional white bread labels. Wheat flour that has been stripped of much of its natural nutrient content during processing, then fortified afterward with synthetic vitamins to replace some of what was removed. That's a standard industry process, not unique to any single brand, but it's also not something the word enriched communicates on its own. If this breakdown has been useful so far, a quick like helps more people find it before they buy one of these loaves without knowing what's actually been checked and what hasn't. Takes about a second. Back to the list, because the next few brands are where the story gets more specific, not less. Number 5, Nature's Own. Flowers. Foods runs one of the largest bread operations in the country, and Nature's Own is the flagship. It's the best-selling loaf bread in the United States, according to Flowers Foods' own fiscal 2024 reporting. Florida's Department of Health tested 2 Nature's Own products in the same round. Butter bread came back at 190.23 parts per billion, and perfectly crafted white came back at 132.34. That butter bread number sits close to the highest single reading recorded anywhere in Florida's entire study. Still legal, still well under the 30,000 parts per billion ceiling, but close enough to the top of this data set that it deserves to be said plainly instead of buried. The brand name does a lot of the selling by itself. Natural, wholesome, a loaf that sounds like it came from somewhere honest. The lab result doesn't change what's printed on the bag. It changes what you should assume the name is actually telling you. The same calcium propionate mechanism discussed earlier in this list applies here too, since it's one of the most common mold inhibitors in mass market bread generally, and the same caution applies. A small study linking it to behavioral changes in some children is evidence worth knowing, not proof it affects every loaf or every child who eats it. Squeeze a slice of this bread between two fingers and let go. A loaf built for a long shelf life tends to spring back to its exact original shape almost instantly, holding that softness for days past when bread naturally starts to firm up and go stale. We're about halfway through this list now, and the next few brands include a fairness concession we don't get to make very often on a list like this, a certified class action lawsuit, and the highest single number in this entire investigation. Stay with us. Number 4, Pepperidge Farm. The red packaging, the script lettering, a name that sounds like it belongs to an orchard with a stone wall out back. Pepperidge Farm has been baking since 1937, founded by Margaret Rudkin, and has been owned by the Campbell Soup Company, now the Campbell's Company, since 1961. Campbell reported $9.6 billion in net sales for fiscal 2024. Here's the fairness concession. Florida's Department of Health tested Pepperidge Farm's Farmhouse Hardy White in the same February 2026 round, and it came back non-detect. No glyphosate found. Credit where it's due. That's a genuinely clean result, and it's the only one in this entire investigation. That result deserves to stand on its own without an asterisk. So why is Pepperidge Farm still on this list? Because glyphosate isn't the only question worth asking about a heritage brand charging a premium price. Bayer, which acquired Monsanto in 2018, has paid more than $11 billion resolving roughly 170,000 Roundup lawsuits alleging the herbicide causes non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And in February 2026 proposed a $7.25 billion nationwide class settlement covering current and future claims. Bayer continues to deny that glyphosate causes cancer. The World Health Organization's cancer research arm classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans back in March 2015. That classification placed glyphosate in the same broad risk category the agency uses for several substances still legal and widely used across the food system today. A category built on limited evidence in humans and sufficient evidence in animal studies. Not a declaration that every exposure causes harm. None of that is specific to this one loaf. Pepperidge Farm's own tested product came back clean, and that matters. And what doesn't change is that you're paying a heritage premium for a brand whose parent company sits inside one of the largest ongoing consumer chemical litigations in the country, over an ingredient this particular loaf happened not to have. Number 3. Dave's Killer Bread. This is the brand health-conscious shoppers reach for without a second thought. Bold packaging, dense-seeded loaves, USDA organic certification, non-GMO project verification, a founder's redemption story printed right on the bag. And on the one metric this entire investigation has been built around, Dave's Killer Bread earned it. Florida's Department of Health recorded 11.85 parts per billion of glyphosate in white bread done right and 10.38 in 21 whole grain, the lowest detectable reading of anything tested in the entire study. Tear a slice in half and look at the crumb structure before judging a seeded loaf like this by density alone. An open, slightly irregular crumb with visible whole grains and seeds distributed unevenly is closer to how bread behaves without heavy mechanical processing than the tight uniform crumb you'll find in a mass-market white loaf. That's genuinely good, and it should be said plainly instead of buried under a caveat. But the honest reason Dave's Killer Bread is on this list has nothing to do with glyphosate. On September 20th, 2024, a federal court in the Northern District of California certified a class action against the company and its parent Flowers Foods, covering the period from December 2017 to September 2023, alleging that Dave's Killer Bread overstated the protein content printed on the front of certain packages, that the grams of protein figure wasn't expressed the way FDA rules require, using a digestibility-adjusted method, and that the real usable protein was lower than advertised. Flowers Foods has denied the allegations. This is the twist worth sitting with. The cleanest lab result in this entire investigation belongs to a brand facing a certified class action over whether the number on the front of the bag can be trusted at all. Number 2, Sara Lee Honey Wheat. Sara Lee has been a familiar name in American kitchens for decades, historically associated more with desserts than sandwich bread. And honey wheat leans on that same nostalgia the way Wonder does. Sara Lee's bread business has been owned by Grupo Bimbo since 2011, the same parent company behind Arnold. Florida's Department of Health tested Sara Lee Honey Wheat in the February 2026 round and recorded 191.04 parts per billion of glyphosate, the highest single reading in this entire investigation. Food Safety Magazine's own reporting on this data set put that number in context. Even at 191.04 parts per billion, Sara Lee Honey Wheat sat more than 150 times below the EPA's legal tolerance for wheat. Legal, again, by a wide margin. In fairness, Sara Lee's other tested loaf in the same round, Artisano White, came back non-detect. And a fair investigation reports that too, not just the number that makes the better headline. There's a second thread from Grupo Bimbo's history worth mentioning here as well. The same 2013 class action that named Arnold also named Sara Lee, alleging its whole grain labeling overstated what was actually inside the loaf. That case was certified and eventually settled. Two separate questions, both pointing at the same company. The highest tested number in this entire dataset on one loaf and a settled lawsuit over whether the label told the truth about what was in the bag in the first place. Number 1, 365 by Whole Foods. Amazon acquired Whole Foods Market for $13.7 billion in a deal announced in June 2017 and closed that August. Whole Foods has spent decades building a reputation as the one grocery chain willing to say no to ingredients other stores won't touch. Here's the honest answer for its own house brand sandwich bread. Nobody has ever tested it for glyphosate in public. Florida's Department of Health didn't include it in this round. The only glyphosate figure that has ever been publicly tied to the 365 name comes from a completely different report, published in 2016, and it wasn't even bread, it was a cracker. Whole Foods 365 organic golden round crackers, which came back at 119.12 parts per billion in that testing round. Not the sandwich loaf sitting on shelves today. Not this product. Nobody has published a number for the actual bread, and that's worth sitting with for a second. The one grocery chain that built its reputation on refusing shortcuts is also the one major bread brand on this entire list, with zero public testing data behind its own house brand loaf. A 2015 study out of King's College London found that rats given ultra-low doses of a Roundup-based herbicide, 0.1 parts per billion in drinking water, far below anything a regulatory tolerance is built to measure, showed altered expression across more than 4,000 genes in liver and kidney tissue after 2 years. That study isn't about this specific bread, it's about the gap between what current testing catches and what current science is starting to ask about doses far smaller than any tolerance was designed to notice. Whole Foods can say accurately that this particular product has never returned a bad result. It cannot say the test was run and came back clean, because as far as the public record shows, the test was never run at all. For context on how a bread company responds when public pressure lands on one specific ingredient, In 2014, Subway removed azotic carbonamide, a dough conditioner also used in some synthetic rubber and foam products, from its bread after a petition gathered more than 92,000 signatures, and after the Environmental Working Group had already flagged the additive in roughly 500 food products. That's what happens when the pressure becomes specific enough to act on. Whole Foods hasn't faced that kind of specific pressure on this product because the specific number that would create it has never been published. Now that you know what to avoid, here are the 4 that actually earned it. These aren't consolation picks. They're the 4 brands in this entire investigation that carry a real verifiable certification instead of just a clean-sounding name. Best option number 1, Angelic Bakehouse. This is a family-owned bakery out of Wisconsin, founded in 2009 by Jenny and James Marino, built specifically around sprouted grain bread rather than milled flour. Angelic Bakehouse carries non-GMO project verification, confirmed back in 2015, and the company doesn't use artificial preservatives or dough conditioners in its sprouted lines. It doesn't hold a glyphosate-specific certification the way a couple of brands later on this list do. And we should say that plainly, because a fair investigation concedes a brand's limits along with its strengths. Because there's no dough conditioner keeping it soft indefinitely, a loaf like this behaves the way bread did before shelf stability became the priority, firming up within days rather than weeks. The honest trade-off is availability. This is a regional, family-run operation, and depending on where you shop, you may need a natural grocery store rather than your regular supermarket to find it. Best option number 2, Alvarado Street Bakery. This is a worker-owned cooperative out of Petaluma, California, incorporated as a co-op in 1981, and it has grown from 5 original members to roughly 116 today, each with an equal vote in how the company runs. Alvarado Street is known specifically for flourless sprouted whole wheat bread, and its loaves carry USDA organic certification made with non-GMO ingredients. A worker-owned structure doesn't automatically make a loaf of bread better, but it does mean the people baking it have a direct financial stake in the quality of what goes into it, not just the margin at the end of the quarter. Open a bag, and the difference is immediately noticeable by smell alone, closer to a bakery than a plastic-wrapped shelf product, though that's a subjective impression and not a lab measurement. The trade-off here is price and distribution. Alvarado Street runs more expensive than a conventional loaf, and depending on your region, it can be genuinely hard to find outside natural grocery chains. Best option number 3, Food for Life. Ezekiel 4:9 sprouted. This bread has no milled flour in it at all. It's built from sprouted whole grains and legumes instead, baked at a controlled temperature to keep more of the nutrients intact than a conventional flour-based loaf. Food for Life has been family-owned by the Torres family since the company started in 1964, and it's now headquartered in Corona, California. Here's the certification that separates this brand from almost everything else on this list. Food for Life holds biochecked, non-glyphosate certified status on 55 of its products. That's not the same thing as USDA Organic, which verifies farming practice. Biochecked certification verifies a lab result on the finished product tested annually by an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory against a zero tolerance threshold. That's the standard every brand on the avoid list above was missing, one way or another. Either the test never happened, or the result came back with a number attached to it. You'll typically find Ezekiel bread in the freezer section rather than the regular bread aisle. And it's worth knowing this loaf, like the others on this half of the list, generally has a shorter shelf life than what you're used to. That's not a flaw in the product. It's closer to what bread without heavy preservation actually behaves like. Because it's kept frozen rather than shelf-stable at room temperature, it also sidesteps the entire category of preservative built to keep a loaf soft for weeks. The same category of ingredient this investigation kept running into throughout the avoid list above. Best option number 4. Silver Hills Sprouted Bakery. This is a family-owned Canadian company based in Abbotsford, British Columbia, operating since 1989. Every product line carries biochecked, non-glyphosate certified status. the same lab-verified standard behind Food for Life's bread. And to be precise about the certification landscape here, neither Silver Hills nor Food for Life sits on the Detox Project's separate glyphosate residue-free list. That's a different certifying body altogether. BioChecked is the one doing the testing on both of these brands. Silver Hills also carries non-GMO project verification and certified vegan status, and it sprouts its own grain on site rather than sourcing pre-milled flour from a third party. Of the 4 brands on this list, Silver Hills is the one most likely to sit on a shelf at a mainstream grocery store, rather than requiring a specialty trip, which makes it the easiest of the 4 to actually switch to without changing how your kitchen already works. Between all 4 brands on this list, the certifications differ in exactly how they're earned. Non-GMO, project verified, checks the seed and the farming input. BioChecked non-glyphosate. Certified checks the finished loaf itself in a lab, and USDA, organic, checks the farming practice. 3 different questions, and it's worth knowing which one each label is actually answering. So how do you tell the difference yourself, standing in the aisle without a lab report in your pocket? Here's what this entire investigation actually comes down to. A USDA organic seal tells you the farmer didn't spray glyphosate on purpose. It says nothing about drift from the field next door, and it says nothing about a lab test on the finished loaf. Only one kind of claim on a bread label means the product itself was actually tested after it was baked. A named certification like BioChecked non-glyphosate certified, which uses a zero tolerance threshold verified annually by an accredited lab. Worth knowing, too, the EPA's 30 parts per million tolerance for wheat grain is actually the stricter of the 2 glyphosate limits that apply to the same crop. The leftover straw and forage from that same wheat field is allowed up to 100 parts per million, more than 3 times the limit set for the grain itself, because straw and forage aren't expected to be eaten directly by a person the way flour is. And here's a separate rule worth carrying with you regardless of glyphosate. California's Food Safety Act, signed in October 2023 and taking effect in January 2027, bans potassium bromate, red dye 3, brominated vegetable oil, and propylparaben from anything sold in that state. A reminder that legal everywhere in America and acceptable by every state's own current standard are not always the same claim either. Before you go, one honest note about how this video was built. Every single number in it, every parts per billion figure, every dollar amount, every date is sourced from a document we opened and read ourselves. State Health Department testing, SEC filings, federal court records, peer-reviewed studies, and certification bodies you can look up independently. The full source list is in the description below this video, with links so you don't have to take our word for any of it. 4 of the 9 brands on the avoid list, Great Value, Simple Truth Organic, Arnold Whole Grains, and 365 by Whole Foods, have never had a glyphosate result published for the public to check at all, and we think that gap is worth knowing about on its own, separate from any number. If this changed how you look at what's sitting in your bread drawer, passing it along to someone who buys one of these 9 regularly is probably the most useful thing you can do with it. And if you've already made the switch to one of the 4 on the safe list, drop a comment with what you moved to. It helps us figure out what to test next. Bread is one category. The same testing gap some brands checked constantly, others never checked at all, shows up across almost everything else in a grocery store. And that gap is usually a more honest predictor of what you don't know than any single number could be. 9 brands with real checkable questions attached to them. 4 that actually answered those questions before we asked. Stay sharp, read the label, and know your food.